Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Nun Hey Amud Beis, starting with Nun Hey Amud Aleph, 7 lines from the bottom. The Gemara had previously brought a brisa explaining the expansion of a city depending on its configuration. The Gemara now continues to analyze this brisa. Haisa asu kimin keshes or kimin gam. If the configuration of the city was the configuration of a keshes, of an arch or a bow, or a gam, kimin gam is the backwards reish. That means you have the houses like a backwards reish, or the houses were in a situation of like an arch, a bow. Roi nosan ki'ilu hi malaya batim. The Brisa states we view them as if they're closed. At the end of the bow, you have both ends, then as if there's an imaginary line closing it off. Or the mingam, where you have the backwards reish, which is closed off like a square. We will then measure the 2,000 amot tchum from the way it is closed off. And we'll consider the area inside as if it's filled with houses. That's the brisa. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna, Ir ha'asuya bekeshes im yesh bein shnei rosheha pochos me'arbas alafim ama moidinin lo min hayeter v'im lav moidinin lo min hakeshes. Rav Huna comes and states that if the distance between the heads of the bow that draw a bowstring is going to be less than 4,000 amos, then he says it's going to be valid as the way the Brisa states. We can go ahead and close it and then consider the inner area as filled with houses and measure our tchum from there. However, if it's going to be 4,000 amos or more, he states, then not. Then you have to then count 2,000 amos from the houses on the keshes. Ask the Gemara, Umiyam Rav Huna, Hachi, did Rav Huna really state this? V'homer Rav Huna, because Rav Huna states somewhere else, Choymas ha'ir shenifritza b'meya ve'arboim v'achas v'shlish. If you have a city that has a breach in its wall, and the breach then separated 2 areas of that city, the separation of up to 141 1/3 amma, if it's going to be more than that, it's going to be considered to be 2 separate areas, 2 separate cities. If it's that amount or less, then it's considered to be combined, whereby in terms of tchum, you can go ahead and count after you going through one area to another area, 2,000 amos outside the other area. So here we see clearly that Rav Huna says that it's only the small amount of 141 1/3 is going to then make this separation. Whereas you're saying before in the name of Rav Huna that if the keshes, the distance between one end and the other end of the bow, which would make a bowstring of 4,000 amos or more, then that will then not going to then separate. Otherwise, it'll be considered to be one area, one expanded city. So here we see that it's a much smaller amount. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Bar Ula Lokasha, it's not difficult because kan beruach achas, kan beshtei ruchos. In the case of the keshes, we're talking about one ruach that you're enclosing. Then it needs a greater amount in order to then separate the areas. But the case where we're talking about a breach in the wall, they're talking actually that the breach went all the way through. It went mefulash through one wall into the other outside wall parallel to it. Then it needs a smaller amount to separate the 2 cities. Ask the Gemara, once you're telling me that Rav Huna says when you have a wall that is breached all the way through another wall separating the 2 cities, if it's going to be 141 1/3, which we're saying the significance of that is that it's really 2 karpef. A karpef is 70 2/3, whereby the Chacham said it's aser midrabanan as a carmelis to carry in that area. So that area, if it's 2 of them, is this distance of 141 2/3. Sorry, 141 1/3. So says the Gemara, Omar Abbe Bar Ula, ask the Gemara, Umay My kamash malan. What is this that Rav Huna is coming to teach us? The noisning karpef lezu, that you're able to put one karpef of 70 and 2/3 and one karpef of 70 and 2/3 that's going to be in between two cities, that each city can have a karpef. That we know already that can be done, as we taught already before. Behold, Rav Huna explained that based on the following Mishnah before. This not on top of Nun Hey Amud Beis. Reb Meir says every city has a karpef outside of it of 70 and 2/3 amos, whereby you only measure the tchum outside of the end of the karpef. Whereas the Chachamim argue, they say you only say a karpef when it's between two cities. The Itmar, and we have a statement to explain this, the position of the Chachamim who say you only have one karpef between two cities. Rav Huna states, karpef lezeh v'karpef lezeh. If you have a karpef to this, it will go be a karpef to one city and a karpef to the other city. One karpef will be then for both cities, that will combine the two. So we see over here that Rav Huna had already taught, based on this Mishnah, that when you have two cities and you have two karpef in between them, that will be a total distance of 141 1/3. So what is he coming to Mechadish over here? Says the Gemara Tzricha, we need both cases, because if we only had the case where the breach goes into the wall, and thereby we said if it has 141 and 1/3, then it's still considered to be one area. Otherwise, it's greater than that. It's going to be splitting the two area, the two cities. So that we need, because mishum dahava leitzad heter meikara aval hasam emaloi. The reason why we say that that's valid to have this large space of 141 and 1/3 is because it initially was at tzad heter. Initially, before the breach took place, one can carry it's one big area, one big ear. And therefore is one techum outside of that city. But over here in this case that the Mishnah is talking about, where you have two separate cities and in between there's two karpefin, so there we might think only one karpef would be valid, but more than that not. Comes along Rav Huna says no, even a distance of 141 1/3 would also not separate two cities. V'yashmin hasam, and if we only had the case when you have two cities with two karpef in between, I would say mishum de dechika tashmishtayhu, because there each city needs its usage in the karpef, and therefore you can have a karpef each, a total of 141 1/3. Aval hocha deloy dechika tashmishtayhu emaloi. But over here, in regards to the breach of the wall, there, it never had a need to have an area to do its tashmish, to have its usage, and therefore I would think that one karpef is sufficient, not two karpef. Kamash malan, therefore Rab Huna comes to teach us even 141 and 1/3 is going to be enough to combine the two. Only greater than that is going to be a problem. Tzricha, and therefore we need both cases. Ask the Gemara now, once we had established that the bow can go from one end to another end, the bowstring, we said up to 4,000 amos, and then it's considered to be one area. Beyond that, it's going to be considered to be two separate areas. It's going to be each house, you're going to have to count from the house 2,000 amos. Now ask the Gemara, v'kama have ben yeter lekeshes, how much is going to be between the head, let's say, where the bowstring is, to the middle of the keshes, the middle of the bow itself. That distance, how much can that be? Rabba barav Huna Omar alpayim amos. He says it's only limited to 2,000 amos. More than 2,000 amos is already going to be beyond a regular tichum, and therefore we'll say it's two separate areas. It's not going to be considered one expanded city. Rava bereid Rabba barav Huna Omar afilu yoser. Yes, Yasser me alpayim amos, even as beyond 2,000 amos. So we have over here the grandson and who's being choylek on his father. In other words, Rava Rav Huna, he says even more than 2,000. And his father, Rabba Bar Rav Huna, he says only up until 2,000. Omar Abai Kavose de Rava Bar Rav Huna, Mistabra. It is like the opinion of the son of Rabba Bar Rav Huna, the Hainu Rava, his opinion is mistaber, that it's even beyond 2,000 amos. Di'i boi, because if a person wanted hadar osi derech batim, if he wanted to, he could walk all through the keshes, all through the bow, and then get to the greatest distance of 4,000 amos, which means that he can go ahead and go across within 2,000 amos of each area. So therefore, we see that it's going to be even beyond 4,000 amos, even beyond 2,000 amos would not be a problem. You don't have any limitation. So long as you can have between the heads of the bow, the height of the bowstring, we said, cannot be more than 4,000 amos, then, and since you can get to that area by going through the houses, so therefore there's not going to be a problem to have a certain limitation on the area between the middle of the bow and the heads of the bow. The Gemara now quotes the Mishnah saying that we also will measure the techum of the city from its ruins. Havusham gedudiyos gevois asar tfachim that are 10 tfachim high. Ask the Gemara, my gedudiyos, these 10 tfachim high gedudiyos, these ruins, what is the further definition of them that will allow them to expand the city's tchum? Omar Rav Yehuda sholosh mechitzos she'en lahem tikra. If they have 3 walls, even without a tikra, without a roof, it's considered to be then a ruin that we're referring to. From there, we'll then be able to count 2,000 amos. Ask the Gemara, Iboiluhu, Shtei mechitzos v'yesh alein tikra mahu. Granted, we just said ruins that are 3 walls without a roof. What about 2 walls that do have a roof? Is that going to be considered an expanded area of the city or not? Toshma, let's bring a proof and try to prove that indeed it's not going to be valid to expand the city. With the following brisa, Elu shemis abrin ima. The first part of the brisa states a list of those that we can use to expand the city with. Nefesh yesh bo arba amos al arba amos. If you have a kever, nefesh is referring to a kever, a tombstone that has daled al daled amos, and there's a structure above it. Normally, a person who's being shomer the kever would then dwell there. V'hagesher v'hakever sheyesh bohen beis dira, or a bridge, or here talking about a beis hakvaros, again where there is a beis dira. Ubeis haknes sheyesh bo beis dira lechazan, a beis haknes which normally doesn't have people sleeping there, but there's a beis dira for the chazan. Ubeis avodah kochavim sheyesh bo beis dira lekoimrim, or lahavdil, a beis avodas kochavim that has a place where the priest, the koimer, would dwell. If you have horse stables or storehouses that store wine or oil or grain in the fields, again, these are places where people don't normally dwell, but they have yesh behen beis dira that they could dwell. Or different places where the shomer of the field, his little huts, or a house that is by an island that is within the area of the city. All of these are going to be considered an extension of the city, and we'll count the 2,000 amos outside of these areas. Now the Brisa lists the opposite, those who cannot be expanded as part of the city. If you have a kever that had a structure, but it was nifratz, it had now a breach in both walls, and you have a bridge or a Beis HaKvoros that does not have a Beis Dira, for somebody to be shomer of the Beis HaKvoros, Ubeis HaKnesses she'ein la Beis Dira lechazan, or a Beis HaKnesses that doesn't have a place for the chazan to dwell, Ubeis Avodah Zarah, Beis HaKvoros she'ein la Beis Dira lechaimrim, ve ha'uravois v'ha'oitzrei she'besada she'ein la Beis Dira. Again, they don't have a place for a person to then dwell. Ubor v'siach umare, or you have a pit, or a ditch, or a cave, v'gode v'shoivach, or a fence, or a place where the doves are raised, shebetoich, inside the fields, v'habai shebesvina, a house on a boat, which is constantly moving, and therefore doesn't have daled amois. Ein elum es abrimo. All of these are lists of things that are not considered to be part of dwellings, and therefore they're not going to be part of the expanded part of a city to count the tchum from. So now the Gemara brings its intended raya from this brisa. Ketani mihas nefesh nifritza mishtei ruchoser elach ve'elach. It's stated in the latter part of the brisa that when it comes to a kever, if the walls were breached, then we say that it's breached on both sides, two walls, one wall and then all through mefulash to the other wall. It says that it's not going to be a way of expanding the city's tichum. So we see from here, we're left with a ruin that only has two walls. So says the Gemara, my lav the ika tikra. Are we not talking about that it also has a tikra, a roof? So we have two walls and a roof, and we asked a ruin that has two walls and a roof, what is the din? Is it considered to be that part of the expanded city or not? So here we're going to prove that it's not. Says the Gemara, lo, you have no proof. Because over here, the lekka tikra, here we don't have a tikra, there's no roof. But perhaps when you have two walls and a roof, it would be considered to be an expanded area of the city. So we don't have a way of proving the question that we had asked. The Gemara now asks, Bais shebiyam lamai chazyu, a house that is in the island, what is it used for? It's only a sole dwelling over there. How can a person have a dwelling in the island that is close enough to the city? Who's going to then be able to then, what's it going to be used for? It's used to unload cargo that is on a boat as a storage place. Ask the Gemara, it says over here in this brisa that a cave is not going to be used as an expanded area of the city. V'hatani asked the Gemara, Rebbe Chia Ma'ara Misaberes Imo. He says that a cave does expand the tchum of the city. Answers the Gemara, Omar Abaye Kishayesh Binyan Alpia. We're talking about a Ma'ara, a cave that has a binyan that is over its entrance to the cave. Ask the Gemara, that's so, mishum binyan gufe, then say it has its extension of the city because of the binyan, not because of the cave. Answers the Gemara, lo tzricha lahashlim, the binyan, the structure itself is not dalid al dalid, and therefore it needs to have a hashlama from the ma'ara. Only the cave is mashlim, this dalid al dalid structure. And therefore, it's necessary to state over here that it's the ma'ara that will have a structure on its entrance that will be then a valid way of extending the tichum. If you have a community of people who are living in huts, then Rav Huna tells us that they do not extend this as a city. They don't go from, they're not considered to be one big city or one whatever town that you're going to go ahead and go out 2,000 amos from the end of that town. No, each one from their Pesach Habayis, because since these are only huts that are temporary and they don't have a kevius, therefore they cannot be considered to be one area that is combined as one town, one city. Mosti Rav Chizda asked, but it says in the Torah, Vayachanu al hayardim mibeis hayishimois. It says that Klal Yisrael, they encamped on the Yardim mibeis hayishimois. Now, when Klal Yisrael dwelled in the Midbar, they were dwelling in huts. V'omar Rabbi bar Rav Huna bar Chano ledidi chazi li hahi asro. I saw that place myself. V'have tlasa parsi al tlasa parsi, and it was 3 parsa al 3 parsa, which is 24,000 amos by 24,000 amos. which is a tremendous amount of area. The Tanya, and it states, when they would have to relieve themselves, they wouldn't be able to go from the front or from the side, going outside of the clouds, because maybe the clouds will travel on the front, toward the front, or toward the sides. So therefore, what would they do? They'd have to then lifnin elu la'acharein. They have to go outside the encampment all the way to the back. That means a person who was in the beginning, the front of the encampment, he'd have to travel 24,000 amos to get to the end outside in the back to then relieve himself. So how could it be if indeed we're saying that when it comes to huts, it's considered to be each one measures from his Pesach Habayis, and it's not considered to be one area, one town, one community? Omar le Rava answers, no, there's a chiluk. You're talking about the encampment of the Jewish people in the desert. That's different. Since it says in the pasuk, Al pi Hashem yachanu, ve'al pi Hashem yiso, that on the mouth, on the say-so of Hashem, will they encamp? On the say-so of Hashem, do they travel? Therefore, it's considered to be as having a kavius. So although they dwelled in tents, in huts, nonetheless, that dwelling was considered to be kavius because of pi Hashem yachanu. Omer Rav Chinina bar Rav Kehan, Omer Rashi, im yesh sham shalosh chatzeros shel shnei batim hukba'u. If he now qualifies what we just said before in regards to huts, we said they're not considered to be one community, one town. However, he comes and says, in the name of Ashi, if there are 3 chatzeros that each one has 2 houses, 2 proper structures, wooden houses, let's say, or stone houses, so then hukbu, then all of the other area, meaning all of the other structure that are even huts, will be considered to be part of this one town, and therefore you count the 2,000 amot tchum from the outside. Rav Yehuda Marav, Yoshvei Tzrifin v'holchei midbaros, those who dwell in huts and those who are traveling in the deserts, chayeyim einam chayim, their lives are not lives. Why? Because after all, they're going to be affected by the elements all of the time because of different weather and such. Unishem b'neim einan shalom, and their wives and their children are not theirs, meaning that they had children out of wedlock. Tani nami hoch, we have a brayso that also supports this. Eliezer ish birya oimer yoshvei tzrifin ki yoshvei kvorim. Those who dwell in huts, they're like dead people. Ve'abunoseim hu oimer, and on their children, on their girls, their daughters, they said about them, Orur, sheichiv im kol behema. That means that they had illegitimate relations that then resulted in such children. My time, what's the reason? Says the Gemara to explain. Because since they had to dwell in huts, it's a temporary dwelling, and therefore they didn't have places to bathe themselves. Says the Gemara, Ula Omar, Shein lehem marchtzois. They didn't have bathhouses, so therefore the men had to then travel to then go to bathhouses that were far away, leaving their wives as prey to people who are immoral to come into these towns. Because people who are immoral would notice when the ladies had to go out to toivel themselves, and therefore they would prey on these ladies this time when they were outside traveling amongst the women themselves, outside of their cities without their husbands. My beinayu, ask the Gemara, what's the difference between these two reasons, marchtzois or makom beis hatvila? Says the Gemara, ika beinayu. The difference is nahara desamich lebeisa. If there was a river that was close to the house, so the women would use that for their place of tevila. Therefore, they didn't have to travel. Whereas when it comes to merchtzois, the husband would still have to go a far distance to then bathe themselves, whereby they would leave their wives alone in the city being preyed upon by immoral people.